A nobleman named Kuro Heartfield was enjoying tea when he accidentally spilled it after hearing surprising news from his secretary. He was going to be married. Kuro was a noble who had been governing a remote land for over 4 years. Although he was only 19 years old, his competence earned him the title of lord at a young age. However, that wasn't the only reason he became a lord. In truth, he was given the position to isolate him, essentially a quiet form of demotion. Kuro also had memories of his past life. In that life, he worked as a clothing pattern maker until he died at the age of 25. He also remembered an anime game from his past life called Kasasu, which was set in the Jade Kingdom's academy. The game's story revolved around using alchemical magic to solve problems through love and battle. Kuro had been reincarnated into that game world, but since he was older than the main characters, he had little involvement at the academy, not that he wanted any. His secretary Gray offered to pour him more tea. Kuro was content with his peaceful life in the countryside, balancing work and relaxation. It was the perfect life. However, Gray urged him to face reality and listen to the marriage proposal. He was happy that someone was willing to marry Kuro despite his bad reputation among noblewomen. Apparently, Kuro was known by the nickname Perverted Deviant, a fact he was hearing for the first time. Kuro found it troubling to learn that he was getting married. Gray told him it was already decided and showed him the church's certificates and his parents' approval form. Technically, they were already married. Kuro saw that the documents were legitimate, but his wife's family name looked familiar. He felt like he had seen it somewhere before. Since both the church and his parents had approved, Kuro couldn't complain anymore. Still, he hoped his partner wouldn't mind the countryside or the age gap between them. Gray sneered and asked if Kuro was into little girls, which Kuro quickly denied. Gray brushed off Kuro's reaction and pointed out that he was going to marry someone from the Valentine family. Kuro was sure he had heard that family name before. It had to be important in this world. Gray then revealed that Kuro's bride was Violet Valentine, a member of a duke's family. Kuro immediately remembered Violet from the game Kasasu. Violet Valentine is the rival of the protagonist in most routes of the Otome game. She was known as a beautiful villainess, but her fate was tragic in every scenario. In the first route, Violet hurt the protagonist and was killed by an enraged love interest. In the second, she became a victim of a rampaging monster. In the third, she challenged the protagonist and a target character to a duel, lost, and was expelled from the academy. Afterward, she lived in a distant convent until she died suddenly. In the fourth route, she married an ugly man from the countryside after losing the duel and expulsion, and she worried about being mistreated by a pervert. Kuro realized that the game creator really seemed to have it out for Violet, considering those endings. Then it hit him. Violet was on the fourth route right now. He couldn't believe it. He was the ugly guy from the countryside. If his sister were there, she would probably throw a party to celebrate her brother finally getting married after having no luck with women. Kuro figured that if someone close to the royal family was marrying a noble like him, Violet had probably challenged the protagonist to a duel out of jealousy. He lost, and he had to take responsibility. From what he remembered, Violet had a harsh personality. He doubted they would get along. Kuro suddenly glanced at Gray and wondered if Violet had a thing for younger boys. Gray noticed Kuro's stare and suspected that Kuro was thinking of using him to avoid the marriage. Kuro shrugged it off, saying he just thought Violet might prefer good-looking boys like Gray. Gray hoped Violet would like Kuro instead, but Kuro found that unlikely since Violet was clearly interested in Vermilion Randolph, the third prince and a key target. Compared to him, Kuro felt like a plain man. Gray then told Kuro to focus on preparing to entertain their guest instead of sulking. Kuro called him disrespectful for mocking his master. A few days later, Gray looked proud after finishing the job of trimming the bushes near the entrance. Kuro wasn't even sure what the word pruning meant. Just then, Violet entered through the main gate, saying she had taken the liberty of calling out since the gates were already open. She introduced herself and said she looked forward to working with them from now on. Kuro was stunned by her clear, crystal-like voice and her striking violet hair and eyes. She was the same figure he had seen in the game his sister played. However, the aggressive gaze and confident demeanor he remembered were now replaced by a quiet sadness. This was the woman who became Kuro's wife. They soon sat down for tea, and Kuro apologized for not preparing more. Violet didn't mind, saying she had already caused trouble by arriving earlier than expected. Kuro expected her to scold him, knowing her temper from the game, but Violet calmly sipped her tea and said it helped ease the fatigue from her long journey. Kuro watched her, surprised by how much she seemed to enjoy the tea. He started wondering if she was a better person than he had thought. Her calm and graceful manner reflected the elegance of someone from a noble family. Her tall frame made her seem mature despite being only 15, and every movement was refined, showing the signs of a good upbringing. Kuro remembered that her swordsmanship matched any skilled man, and her academic performance was consistently at the top. He realized just how talented Violet truly was. Since she was the game's main rival, He figured she must have challenged the protagonist to a duel, and lost. However, what bothered him most was her hair. He couldn't help but wonder if it had always been that straight. Violet noticed him staring, and Kuro quickly apologized for being rude. He introduced himself and mentioned how long he had served as the land's lord. He hoped they could look forward to their future together despite the sudden marriage. Violet coldly replied that she looked forward to it as well. She then reintroduced herself as the eldest daughter of the Valentine Duchy and the woman who had exchanged vows with Kuro. Her composed tone almost made Kuro call her Her Highness. She then realized she should start calling herself Violet Heartfield since she could no longer use the Duke's name. Kuro assured her that he wouldn't ask about the recent events until she felt more comfortable. Violet quietly thanked him for his consideration. Kuro already knew why Violet could no longer claim the Duke's name. Her engagement to the duel-crazed prince had been broken and her parents had abandoned her. On top of that, she had been forced to marry a man she barely knew. For a young girl, it was a cruel and overwhelming situation. Kuro then asked Gray to prepare a bath for Violet. He apologized in advance if the place felt cramped. Violet was surprised by his thoughtfulness but still thanked him. While taking a bath, Violet thought about how both she and Kuro had been forced into this situation. She seemed a bit conflicted about it. Meanwhile, Kuro prepared a separate room for Violet. Later that night, Violet knocked on Kuro's door and asked if she could come in. Kuro said he didn't mind and asked what was wrong. When the door opened, Violet stood there wearing thin nightwear that revealed her lingerie. It was too much for Kuro, and he quickly looked away while asking if she needed something. Violet blushed, struggling to find the right words. She reminded Kuro that they were now husband and wife, despite the sudden marriage and barely knowing each other. Kuro quietly agreed. She also mentioned that it was their first time spending the night together in the same mansion. Then she pointed out that it was their wedding night. Kuro was too stunned to respond as Violet stepped closer and slipped off her nightwear. She said she had come to be embraced and pressed herself against Kuro. He remained frozen, too shocked to speak. In most Otome games, the protagonist usually doesn't have a large chest. This was meant to avoid focusing on sexuality since the main goal was to attract potential partners through charm and personality. In contrast, the rivals often had larger chests, highlighting the difference between them and the protagonist. Kuro remembered this because of Violet, who was currently being surprisingly bold with him. She pressed her large chest against him, catching him off guard with her forwardness. They had just gotten married after meeting for the first time, and Kuro couldn't help but notice how big and beautiful they were. However, a part of him realized that designing clothes for such a figure would be challenging. While he had always preferred smaller ones, seeing Violet in front of him made him realize that he liked the bigger ones too. Kuro pushed Violet away, telling her to calm down. He asked her to put on something and talk things through first. Violet looked confused and reminded him that they were now husband and wife, so they should spend their first night together properly. She begged him not to leave her sitting there half-dressed, waiting for him to make a move. Kuro admitted they were married now, so there was nothing wrong with looking at her. Still, if he gave in, Gray would definitely tease him while congratulating him. Violet moved closer, asking him to touch her even though she looked embarrassed. She urged him to hurry up and pushed Kuro down onto the bed, pinning him beneath her. But Kuro noticed her trembling. He didn't want things to happen like this, not when Violet seemed so unsure. Violet's expression turned sad as she asked if Kuro didn't find her attractive. She wondered if men preferred girls who seemed vulnerable and sweet, someone who smiled easily and made others want to protect her. Kuro realized Violet was talking about the protagonist, a petite girl with strong alchemy skills, known for her bravery and kindness. Despite coming from a commoner background, she treated everyone with warmth, regardless of their status. Kuro figured Violet might have felt jealous of what the protagonist had. He also suspected that this situation matched the fourth root of Kasasu. He could only guess that the prince had developed feelings for the protagonist and discarded Violet. Violet insisted that she was already an adult. As a noble, she knew the significance of the wedding night and claimed she was prepared for it. Kuro saw how serious Violet was as she tried to follow the teachings about offering her purity on the first night. As a noble, she was taught to value her name over discomfort and follow tradition even if it brought pain. These lessons were meant to shape her into a proper noble. Seeing how Violet was so bound by this sense of duty, Kuro realized he didn't want to be swept up in that kind of thinking. He then told Violet that he disliked seeing her act that way. Hearing the word dislike made Violet freeze. It reminded her of the prince's harsh words when he told her never to show her face again. The last thing she heard from the person she loved was a rejection. Violet had worked hard to become a woman worthy of the prince, someone strong enough to stand by his side. Even after being rejected, she kept trying to fulfill her role as royalty. Even her father, who once told her that killing her would be unreasonable and still a crime, hadn't rejected her after the engagement was called off. Instead of being sent to a convent, she was told to marry a noble and make herself useful. Violet had heard rumors about Kuro Heartfield, the third son of the Heartfield Baron family. He had dropped out of Azalea Academy and was now a lord in a remote area. The rumors painted him as violent, domineering, lustful, vain, arrogant, and jealous. Not a single good thing was said about him. Violet figured that made him a fitting match for a fallen noble like her. Still, she couldn't find any real meaning in this sudden marriage. Even so, she spoke up first and arrived at her new home. To her surprise, Kuro and his secretary Gray seemed like decent people. She was even more surprised to see Kuro himself cleaning the house. She learned that only Kuro and Gray lived there since they couldn't afford to hire more staff. With just the two of them in such a large mansion, Violet wondered if it was proper for a man and a woman to live alone together. Both Kuro and Gray seemed unsure how to respond. Violet had never been afraid to speak her mind, even after the prince called her a nuisance for giving him advice. She had only done what she thought was right for him and the royal family. Even though she feared losing her family name and severing her connection with the prince, she accepted the Heartfield name. Kuro had told her that he wouldn't ask for details until she felt more comfortable. It was then that Violet realized Kuro wasn't the person the rumors made him out to be. Still, Kuro reminded her that men could be beasts, so she should remain cautious. Kuro had asked Gray to prepare a bath for Violet. Violet understood this as a sign that she needed to purify herself before offering her purity to someone. Since Kuro was known as the perverted deviant, she worried he might try something while she was in the bath. For now, she decided to scold him for not acting like a proper noble. Even if he was her husband, he needed to behave with dignity, regardless of his reputation. While bathing, Violet thought about how she wanted her first time to be special and done properly. She stayed in the bath for a while, but Kuro never showed up. Still, the bath was relaxing. She could stretch her legs freely and the towel was clean. She silently thanked Gray for preparing everything. Despite feeling calm, she remained cautious since Kuro was also in the bath. He might try to approach her in her room later. Amber, her maid, had told her that men usually make the first move, and if the husband desires it, the wife should accept it. This seemed like the perfect moment to wear the special underwear Amber had prepared for her coming-of-age ceremony. Even though she felt unsure, she still put them on. As time passed, Violet remained alone and awake in her room. She wondered if Kuro was still in the bath or perhaps waiting for her. Her classmates had mentioned that women could also take the initiative if they were kept waiting. After hesitating for a while, she decided to make the first move. However, things didn't go as expected. Kuro seemed upset with her. Feeling embarrassed, Violet apologized, thinking that maybe someone like her wasn't good enough. But then, Kuro pulled her closer and held her cheeks. His sudden gesture made Violet's face turn bright red. Kuro's intense gaze and his hands on her cheeks left Violet speechless. He squeezed her soft cheeks, making her feel both confused and surprised. He told her to look into his eyes, and Violet suddenly noticed how beautiful they were, a deep emerald color. It felt strange, almost like it was her first time really seeing his eyes, even though they had already spoken earlier. Kuro then accused Violet of making a fool of herself. He pointed out how she had been acting at the academy, scaring off women who approached Prince Vermilion and ignoring the prince's words. He suggested that the prince might have liked Violet, but her cold and harsh behavior toward those who admired him probably made him hate her. Kuro added that he couldn't forgive her for that and mentioned how he had challenged her to a duel, which ended with him getting hit by the prince and the others. Violet broke into a cold sweat, realizing that no one knew those details until now. Kuro went on, saying that Violet only had attendants, not real friends. When Violet called him rude and insisted there had to be at least one person, Kuro reminded her that this person had likely pulled away because Violet told them not to get too close. Violet wondered how Kuro knew all of this. He then accused her of being a proud duchess who relied on the prince's status to look down on others. He even brought up the embarrassing nickname Amethyst Paper Thin Machine, which apparently came from an incident where Violet and her group caused chaos and ended up humiliating themselves. Embarrassed, Violet asked what he was talking about, but Kuro just squeezed her cheeks harder and told her to listen carefully. She might actually learn something. Kuro wore a kind smile and told Violet that doing something for someone else is sacrificing oneself. However, if that leads to being rejected by someone, it would become painful in the end. But when she came to like someone, he asked her not to deny all the efforts which had been made. Kuro's words sank into Violet, slowly dissolving the heavy emotions buried deep in her heart. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that, deep down, all she ever wanted was to be recognized. She had always taken pride in her actions as the Duke's daughter, but part of her longed for someone to tell her that not everything she had done was wrong. Kuro told her that the Violet he knew was hardworking and strong-willed, which made her beautiful. He encouraged her to be more proud of herself, and not to hate who she was. He admitted that he couldn't stand seeing her dislike herself like that. After being rejected by the prince, all Violet ever wanted was for someone to stay by her side. Now that she and Kuro were together as a couple, they had a connection. But Violet had been acting recklessly, not realizing that she wasn't alone anymore. She thanked Kuro for his kind words, and Kuro was happy to have helped. Violet then mentioned that the rumors about Kuro being a pervert and degenerate might not be so reliable after all. Kuro nervously asked how far that nickname had spread, clearly embarrassed. He turned away, flustered, and told Violet to put something on. Violet paused for a moment, then leaned toward him. She reminded him that it was their wedding night and asked if he really wouldn't hold her. Kuro firmly told her that this wasn't about pity. He wanted her to take her time and create a place for herself first. He reassured her that they had plenty of time to grow together as a couple. Even though Violet felt relieved that she was safe, a small feeling of disappointment lingered inside her. Kuro suddenly leaned forward and kissed Violet on the forehead. She was caught off guard and blushed. Kuro laughed, saying he had planned to do something more impressive, but things didn't go as expected. He figured it was better not to force anything this time. Violet, feeling embarrassed, playfully punched him and called him stubborn. Kuro just laughed and told her to put on some clothes. Afterward, Violet got dressed and talked with Kuro about where she would be living from now on in their upcoming married life. The time with Kuro felt calm and comforting. The next morning, Gray clapped his hands and teasingly congratulated Kuro. Kuro expected that reaction from Gray, but it was still annoying. He insisted that nothing happened the way Gray imagined. Gray joked that lying was the first step toward becoming a pervert. He then asked if nothing really happened on their first night, calling Kuro useless and spineless. Kuro couldn't believe he was getting teased no matter what he did. The night before, the couple talked only until Violet fell asleep after the long journey. She had been talking cutely in her sleep, and Kuro carefully carried her to her room without waking her. Gray said that what mattered most was that Kuro was kind to Violet. He admitted he was just worried since Kuro looked tired. He jokingly asked if Kuro was the type to take advantage of vulnerable women with sweet words, hoping that the two would end up being a quarrelsome couple. Kuro responded that it would probably look bad to others. Gray found it impressive that someone as unpopular as Kuro had managed to handle the situation so well. Kuro brushed it off, saying it was just a coincidence that his words matched with Violet's. He couldn't tell anyone that it was all thanks to his memories from his past life. All he knew was that Violet's self-sacrifice had been genuine, and her efforts were what really mattered. He understood that everyone had strengths and weaknesses. He didn't want to forget the weaknesses, but he also didn't want to be held back by them. Gray wondered if that was all there was to it. Just then, Violet opened the office door and apologized for oversleeping. Kuro understood since she had just come back from a long trip. He greeted her warmly, and Violet smiled as she returned the greeting. She also thanked Gray for the bath, which pleased him. Gray then mentioned that Violet looked much more relaxed compared to the day before. He had heard from Kuro and assumed it was because of the good conversation they had. Violet blushed and held her forehead, saying she had experienced something even the prince had never done to her, but it wasn't unpleasant. She was referring to the forehead kiss, but Gray misunderstood and thought it was something inappropriate. Kuro quickly denied it, telling Gray not to get the wrong idea. Gray laughed and teased Kuro, reminding him they were already married, and playfully congratulated him again. Violet, confused, asked what they were talking about, but Kuro told her not to worry about it. An hour later, the couple finished their meal. Kuro asked Violet if she liked the food. She said she enjoyed its simple and comforting flavor. Kuro was happy to hear that, but wanted to learn more about her taste preferences. Just then, Gray joined the conversation with a serious expression. He said there was something important to discuss with the newly married couple. Kuro asked if he could call Violet his dear mother. The couple paused for a moment until Violet asked why. Kuro scolded Gray for bringing it up so suddenly. Violet then remembered that Gray was Kuro's secretary. Kuro explained that while it might seem that way to others, the truth was more complicated. He formally introduced Gray as both his secretary and his child. Gray appeared calm now, but he had once been a slave under the former lord. When Kuro arrived at the mansion, Gray had already been in a weakened state. He had been following orders without much thought, barely able to speak. Over time, he slowly opened his heart, and as part of that process, Kuro gave him the surname Heartfield. Violet realized that if Gray was Kuro's adopted child, that made her the adopted mother. Gray admitted that it was already hard to believe that a noble would adopt someone like him, so his request to call Violet mother might have been too much. Violet also recalled that the slave trade was technically banned in the country. After considering everything, she decided to take on the role of Gray's mother. Kuro was surprised by how quickly she accepted the idea. Violet then approached Gray and told him he could call her mother any time. Kuro couldn't believe how naturally Violet went along with it. Gray hesitantly called her mother, and Kuro wondered how serious they both were. Still, he could see how gracefully Violet handled the situation, even though her eyes burned with determination. Violet then wondered how she should address Gray. Kuro suggested that she call him the usual name, but Violet wanted to treat him with warmth so their bond as mother and child would grow stronger. Soon they began calling each other like a real mother and child. Somehow, Violet's parental instincts seemed to kick in too hard. Kuro couldn't believe how easily the usually strict and proud princess had been swayed. She looked like a natural airhead at that moment. He asked her to calm down, admitting that while she wasn't wrong, she might have misunderstood something. Violet replied that she had been reflecting on her past and realized that she lacked flexibility. To adapt to this new land, she was determined to become a wonderful mother and raise Gray into someone great. Kuro advised her not to accept everything without question. Gray then thanked them, saying he was happy. Kuro decided to stop questioning the situation, thinking it might be rude to dig any deeper. Despite the commotion, Gray reminded Violet to maintain proper formality between them in public. Kuro could tell Violet was disappointed, realizing that her sense of flexibility still needed some work. Kuro went outside and told Violet to relax for a while since he would show her around later in the afternoon. Violet asked where they were going, but Kuro only said they had some business to take care of. Violet asked to join them. She reminded Kuro that she was now his wife and that a wife should understand her husband's work. Kuro was left speechless by how stunning she looked. When Violet asked if something was wrong, Gray commented that Kuro's composure still had a long way to go. Kuro told Gray to stop saying unnecessary things and warned Violet to be prepared. He said that the duties of a lord were not as easy as she might think. His serious tone made Violet feel a bit nervous. Violet was surprised to see what being a lord actually involved. She found Kuro and Gray working like farmers, which left her confused. Kuro proudly explained that he was tending the fields by spreading fertilizer and tilling the soil with a hoe. Violet was shocked but not entirely surprised, considering Kuro was a lord from the countryside. She reminded herself not to hesitate since she was now part of the Heartfield family. Wanting to help, Violet tried to lift a nearby bucket, but the strong smell overwhelmed her. She asked Kuro what it was, and he explained that it was organic fertilizer mixed with cow and pig manure, which helped crops grow beautifully. Violet hoped Kuro wouldn't mention manure with such a happy expression. Unable to handle the smell, Violet stepped away and apologized for losing her composure. Kuro suggested she rest under the shade. Just then, a villager arrived and praised Kuro and Gray for their hard work in the fields. She offered them fresh vegetables from her garden, which Gray gratefully accepted. The villager playfully warned Kuro not to push himself too hard in front of such a lovely lady. Kuro asked her to stop teasing. Violet had been raised to believe that getting her hands dirty was beneath her, but after seeing how naturally Kuro and the villager interacted, she realized there was something truly rewarding about building connections with others. Kuro accidentally spilled the fertilizer and ended up covered in it. Gray started teasing him, joking that even the fertilizer seemed to like him. Violet watched with concern, which Kuro noticed. He figured it would take some time for her to adjust. Gray told him not to lose hope, but Kuro asked him to stop reading his mind. Later that afternoon, after cleaning up and changing clothes, Kuro offered to show Violet around his domain. As they walked through the streets, Violet noticed a magnificent church ahead. Kuro explained that it was just a relic from the days when it attracted countless believers, but the priest and sister were still there. He mentioned that Shiki, his domain, was a melting pot of different people, most of whom weren't original residents. Violet understood he was talking about people who had stumbled into the place in the past and reassured him not to worry about her. Kuro thought that Shiki really was a place for castaways, just like him. They finally arrived at the church, where Violet asked if there were people who embezzled or went against the church's teachings. Kuro agreed and suggested they meet them first. The inside of the church was empty, but a woman's voice suddenly echoed through the hall, mentioning that someone had ventured out. Violet thought the woman was talking about her, but the real target was Kuro. A woman appeared out of nowhere and suddenly dropped a powerful kick on Kuro, calling him a traitor. The impact was so strong that it stirred up a gust of wind. Violet shielded her eyes from the dust and quickly checked on Kuro. Thankfully, Kuro was strong enough to block the attack. The woman seemed surprised to see Kuro. He swiftly grabbed her leg and threw her aside. However, the woman skillfully spun in midair and landed perfectly on her feet. She couldn't believe that Kuro had managed to evade an attack from a divine messenger like her and called him impressive. She warned Kuro that he would soon face divine punishment. Kuro calmly asked if it was really acceptable for a divine messenger to attack someone without warning. Just then, Gray greeted the woman, Kyan, and remarked how glad she was to see her looking vibrant. Kyan replied that it was also nice to see Gray looking beautiful. Kuro then asked Kyan what she meant about him being a traitor. Violet was confused and couldn't find the right moment to speak. Kyan, visibly angry, asked if Kuro really didn't understand. She claimed that Kuro had committed a grave act of betrayal. Concerned, Violet wondered what Kuro had really done. Kuro didn't understand what Kyan was talking about and asked for an explanation. Kyan couldn't believe that Kuro really didn't understand. She pointed out how Kuro had married someone else, leaving her and the priest behind. She called him nothing but a traitor. Kyan also mentioned that she had wanted to marry Father Snow White. Kuro told her to just confess her feelings. Kyan angrily told him not to mock the pure heart of a maiden with unrequited love. Kuro called her a mess. Kyan then turned to Violet and said she was wasted on someone like Kuro. Still, she offered to handle the wedding when the time came. Violet thanked her for the offer. Cayenne finally introduced herself as Cayenne Sears, the church's only sister. Violet also introduced herself and said she hoped to get along with her. Cayenne decided to give her the nickname I.O. and hugged her. After that, Cayenne excused herself, saying she had an errand to run. Cayenne left suddenly like a storm. Kuro figured Cayenne had been waiting for him to walk in and kick him. Gray noticed something was bothering Violet and asked about it. Violet remembered that people connected to the church usually didn't wear anything under their clothes because of their doctrine. That's why she was surprised that Cayenne wasn't wearing much. What really worried her was Cayenne's deeply slit dress. A small movement, and the flower buds would be exposed. Gray only realized this after Violet pointed it out. Violet then remembered how Cayenne had kicked Kuro from above. She glared at Kuro and questioned what had just happened. Kuro insisted he hadn't seen anything, and was honestly surprised that nothing had been exposed even from that angle. He swore that even if he had seen something, he wouldn't have thought much about it. Violet couldn't believe the pervert was real. She figured Kuro was already used to seeing such things and wondered if he would stay just as calm when it was her turn to reveal something. Kuro quickly denied it, saying that was different. He was trying to stay rational and in control. He asked what Violet was even talking about. Gray, watching from the side, was amused to see a lover's quarrel from the front row. After visiting the church, Kuro led Violet on the rest of the domain tour. Violet agreed, recalling that meeting someone as influential as Cayenne was rare. Suddenly, a man with an eerie aura appeared behind her, making Violet jump. The man congratulated them on their marriage, saying he had heard the rumors about Kuro's wife. Kuro introduced him as Orchid, a citizen of the domain. Although Orchid practiced black magic, he was known to be kind-hearted. Just then, another man showed up and immediately checked Kuro's wounded palm. Kuro casually explained that this man, Ivory, always appeared when someone was injured. He claimed he got the wound while working in the fields. Ivory couldn't believe Kuro was letting the injury sit untreated and insisted on handling it himself. He also asked if Kuro had any other wounds. Kuro swatted Ivory's hand away, saying he would take care of it himself. Violet asked how he was feeling, and Ivory introduced himself as a doctor. Kuro added that Ivory was a bit of a pervert who got overly excited about healing injuries, but despite that, he was an excellent doctor. Ivory told Violet to visit him anytime if she got hurt. Suddenly, a loud man barged in after hearing about Kuro's bride. He called Violet beautiful and asked if she would consider a polygamous marriage. Kuro introduced him as Kark Roberts, a fool who had fled to Shiki after getting into trouble with too many women. Kuro added that Kark would back off if Violet asked him to. Next, a girl appeared and started speaking in dark, complicated words like she was stuck in an 8th grade fantasy phase. Violet had no idea what she was talking about. Kuro translated it as a welcome greeting and introduced her as Apricot, a Chunabu girl who admired witches. As Violet tried to process everything, someone in heavy armor walked past them. She asked who that was. Kuro explained that it was Robo, someone popular with the kids. He added that a shy person named Blonde was underneath the armor. Violet smiled, trying to take in all the strange introductions. She politely told everyone it was nice meeting them, even though she was clearly overwhelmed. Kuro was surprised she was managing to speak at all. Afterward, the couple returned home and Violet was completely exhausted. Kuro handed her a cup of tea. Once she calmed down, Violet commented on how unique the citizens were. Kuro was surprised by how calmly she summed it all up. Gray walked in with a wedding gift from Kark, the loud man from earlier. Kuro told him to throw it away. Violet couldn't believe Kuro was rejecting someone's kindness, but she was curious why the gift was a book with a painted cover. Gray said he didn't know what was inside, but he had heard that the contents were important for newlyweds. Kuro gave the book a quick read and immediately decided to beat up Kark. It was the first time Violet had seen Kuro give off such a murderous aura. The land of Shiki was truly a place where perverts and eccentric people gathered, and Violet could clearly see that the domain was full of strange people. Kuro had no choice but to agree. Noticing the clock, Kuro mentioned that it was already late and asked if Violet had any preferences for dinner. Violet asked if Kuro would be the one cooking. Kuro said he was on duty this time since he and Gray were taking turns. He also mentioned that there was no one else around to cook for them. Violet felt a bit concerned, but Gray assured her that they could handle it. Since Violet looked tired, Kuro decided to make something simple using the vegetables they had received earlier. Violet thought for a moment before telling Kuro that Shiki was a strange place. Kuro asked what she meant, but she wasn't sure how to explain it except that the villagers were unique. Kuro told her not to hold back since he already knew his people were odd. She remembered how most of the villagers they met had congratulated them on their marriage, even though she hadn't done anything for them yet. It surprised her to be congratulated by so many people, especially since it had been a while since her engagement to the prince was annulled. She apologized for bringing up that topic. Still, despite hearing various rumors, she now felt that Shiki wasn't such a bad place after all. Kuro told her not to force herself. Violet found it amusing that even the Lord seemed unsure about the praise for his land. Kuro noticed how Violet's eyes, despite her smile, looked sad. He guessed she was thinking about the past she had left behind. From the game, he remembered what had happened at the academy. He couldn't convince himself that his land was good enough to make her forget those thoughts. He knew it might take time, but he hoped that one day Violet would come to truly love this land. He could only hope. 3 weeks had passed since Violet arrived in Shiki. Compared to her time at the academy, life in the countryside was less convenient. However, with Kuro and Gray's help, she gradually adjusted to it. There were still things she didn't understand. First was Gray, Kuro's secretary and adopted son, who had exceptional magical abilities in all attributes. Violet had once strongly denied the idea of a woman approaching the prince at the academy because of their difference in social status. That woman reminded her of the former feudal lord who had oppressed Gray. She wondered if someone like her deserved to be the mother of a child who had endured such emotional scars. One day while doing chores, Gray tried to imitate Apricot's dramatic words and used magic to cut the grass. Kuro told him to just cut it normally. Curious, Violet approached Gray and asked if he was struggling with any difficult feelings. Gray asked for an example, but then assured her that there was something that made him happy now. He said it was thanks to Kuro, who allowed him to become Violet's child. Violet hesitated and asked why Gray would accept someone like her as his mother. Gray explained that Kuro had never treated him differently, and had even given him a family name. Since Kuro, who had done so much for him, recognized Violet as his wife, Gray naturally accepted her too. Kuro was beloved by everyone in the domain. Despite taking over the land just 3 years ago and being only about 4 years older than Violet, he often seemed more mature and aware of everything that had happened at the academy. Kuro then asked if Violet would be helping with his work again. He handed her a hat and told her to wear it, suggesting that she step out of the shade from time to time. Violet wondered why someone like Kuro wouldn't abandon her. She wanted to understand him better and hoped to walk beside him in this land filled with unique people. Just then, a hooded woman passed by and whispered into Violet's ear. She warned that the esteemed one was advising Violet not to get carried away. Violet replied that she understood. It seemed like she couldn't catch a break. Hearing the warning from the hooded woman made Violet feel sad. She only wanted to walk alongside Kuro and become someone admired like him. Violet assumed that the woman had been assigned by her father to watch over her. She asked what would happen if she ignored the warning, but the woman said nothing. Instead, she simply reminded Violet that she had given her warning before disappearing into thin air. Violet knew all too well that her father no longer cared about her. Still, she could now see more clearly the kind of person she wanted to become. But that wasn't something she wanted to achieve by causing trouble for others, especially Kuro. Just then, Kuro noticed her walking far behind and asked what was wrong. Violet apologized for the delay and suggested they keep going. Kuro asked if there was a reason she had stopped. Violet assured him it was nothing, saying she was just admiring the view. Kuro leaned toward her, looking her in the eyes. He could tell something was off and asked if she was hurt. Violet said it might have just looked that way because of the hat's shadow and assured him she was fine and able to keep working. Kuro said that was good enough for him. Violet insisted there was no problem at all. She was surprised by how sharp Kuro was, but she didn't want to make him worry any further. Gray showed up with a worried look and said something had happened to the field. It was ruined, and Kuro wondered if monsters had caused the damage. They informed the villagers afterward. Ryan asked if Kuro wanted them to protect the town. Kuro confirmed this and explained that there were unfamiliar footprints in the field. If it was a new type of monster, the threat level would be unknown. For now, Kuro decided to scout the surrounding area and ask those who could fight to protect the town while he was away. Kayan assured him that she would handle things. Kuro told Violet to stay behind, but she insisted on going with him. Despite her father's warnings, Violet saw this as her chance to contribute to the domain. She believed it was the duty of nobles to eliminate any threats to the people. In the forest, Violet asked if monster subjugation was common for a lord in Shiki. Kuro said it was rare and told her to be careful. The road was muddy from the rain the night before. Kuro asked if she had any combat experience, and Violet said she had done mock training at the academy. Kuro remembered the training grounds just outside the academy, and recalled a particular scene from the game where the protagonist would slip and fall because of the poor footing, leading to an encounter with the target character. Violet admitted that she wasn't used to the dirt and apologized if it caused any trouble. Kuro reassured her, saying everyone has things they aren't used to. That's what partners are for. Violet said she was counting on him. Kuro was surprised by how straightforward Violet had become. She actively helped with his work and even learned how to cook from Gray so she could help with the mansion's duties. Despite being unfamiliar with rural life and the ways of commoners, Violet was trying her best to adapt. Kuro remembered how Violet always faced a cruel fate in every route of the game. He knew he had to keep a close eye on her. Violet struggled to walk through the muddy path but hurried anyway since the people in the domain were growing uneasy. Kuro warned her that rushing wouldn't help. Suddenly, Violet slipped and closed her eyes, bracing for the fall. Luckily, Kuro caught her just in time and asked if she was okay. Blushing, she apologized and said she owed him one. Kuro replied that he was just relieved she wasn't hurt. Violet then mentioned that the last time Kuro held her like that was on their wedding night. She added that he felt tougher than she had expected. Just then, Violet heard splashing sounds and told Kuro to stay quiet. She mentioned hearing water nearby. They carefully moved forward to find the source of the sound. Violet wondered if there was a river nearby, but Kuro said there shouldn't be one. Even if a monster was bathing in a puddle, the noise was too loud. He thought it might be dangerous if it was a giant monster, so he decided they should head back to town and request reinforcements. Suddenly, they heard a monster's roar and a woman's scream. Violet quietly chanted a spell, and Kuro immediately felt stronger. Violet said they wouldn't have time to call for help. She explained that she had cast a spell to erase their scent and block recognition. Without wasting any time, they ran toward the noise, thinking a traveler might be under attack. Violet and Kuro soon came across a thick cloud of steam. Inside it, they saw the shadows of a group of monsters and a human figure. Violet told Kuro to get down and swung her sword hard, cutting through the steam. As the mist cleared, they saw a woman standing confidently in front of the monsters, making noise to herself. She called the monsters her children and told them to give thanks to the land for the hot springs. The monsters barked at her, and the woman assumed they were admiring her beauty. The couple silently watched as the woman flaunted herself in front of the monsters. Violet asked if this was normal in Shiki, but Kuro denied it. He confirmed that the woman was indeed a genuine pervert. The woman admired her own figure, calling it a perfect golden ratio. She couldn't believe a hot spring capable of enhancing her beauty existed, claiming it was the world's way of showing appreciation for her. Kuro silently agreed that the woman was beautiful, but her exaggerated poses seemed strange to him. He had a feeling he had seen her somewhere before. The woman glared in their direction and told them to look at her naked body with confidence. The couple was shocked that the pervert had noticed them. It would be bad if she turned out to be a demon Tamara who could control countless monsters. The woman then said that art wouldn't be complete without viewers and told them to come out so her artistic value would increase. The monsters barked in agreement. Kuro and Violet thought it was foolish to stay on guard in front of such a woman. They decided to lift Violet's spell and stepped out of the bushes. The woman saw a young man and woman who seemed to appreciate art and called them lucky for meeting her by chance in such a remote place. She said the admission fee was on the house and invited them to enjoy the view of her body. Violet interrupted the woman and asked if she wasn't even a bit embarrassed. Kuro nervously glanced to the side. The woman replied that there was nothing to be embarrassed about since she had nothing to hide. Somehow, Kuro thought that response was cool. The woman then gave them a sharp look and assumed they were a couple. She apologized if that was the case and wondered if Violet was worried that her boyfriend would see her naked and start comparing them. The woman told them not to worry since love could hide such things, but she wasn't sure if there was a love strong enough to surpass her impressive figure. Her words and attitude angered Violet. Kuro quickly stopped his wife from drawing her sword. He realized they were getting nowhere and asked Violet to step back. Kuro then introduced himself by his full name and position as the lord governing the land of Shiki, where they were currently standing. He asked for the woman's identity. The woman apologized for not properly greeting the lord of the land. She introduced herself as a traveler named Schwartz. Kuro froze, sensing that he knew who she was. Schwartz smiled and called their meeting perfect timing, saying it must have been fate that brought them together. Kuro clearly remembered hearing Schwartz's name before. She was another character from the Otomi game. In some routes, hostile characters like her could lead the protagonist straight to a bad ending. Schwartz was one of those dangerous characters who casually killed the game's targets and even the protagonist.